Okay, so Good Yontiv, it's Yutet Kislev. This morning I was trying to think about how do you explain something like this in a wider perspective, and in a wider perspective it would be something like I was thinking whether when when his academy finished the Mishnah, did they have a Yontiv from that day on? Because what they had done was they had moved Torah study from the ancient period to the more modern period at that time. And they had decided to adopt writing, the annals of the academy, the discussions that were going on in the academy. That was a big deal because until then Torah was oral. And it hinged on the fact that there was a tradition of a teacher passing on to a student, and they had to spend a lot of time with one another. The moment that you write books, you do something to that connection, and that connection isn't as strong as it was before. And Torah had to be rethought, or as they say today, reimagined. He reimagined how Torah would be learned, how the oral tradition would develop. And so basically he pushed the Jewish people into a new era. When the Alterabi came out of prison, as we will see this a little bit more in depth a little bit later, he basically started a new era. It had started without a doubt with the Baal Shem Tov and his teacher, the Maggid. But the Alterabi, he took it to a whole new level by writing it down in a, as we'll see, a logical and intellectual sense, in a way that could be transmitted, not just by teacher and student, but also through a book. And that changed the face of what Hasidus is and became completely. Now, this ties into what exactly is Hasidus, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it in that sense, it's this Yom Tov is like a shift. If you understand it, I think from a wider perspective, it's a shift of what Torah is about. It's a shift of what we call or what we say the scope of Jewish life is about. And Hasidus opened up this whole new dimension that was missing until then, and it wasn't missing completely because people were writing here and there about it and speaking about it, but it wasn't organized, it wasn't orderly. And when the Alterabi wrote the Tanya, he in a sense wrote a founding text of how do you enter this new scope of Judaism and where is Torah going now. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. What I want to do is I do want to move a little bit forward with the class we're reviewing, the class which I called Back to Basics. And as I said, this is the last class until now that I've seen that Rav Ginsburg has directly addressed the School of Torah Psychology. And this class was basically like a culmination of 12, 13 years of teaching in the school and his addresses to the school, and giving us one model for how the advisor needs to see his work, right? Or she needs to see her work. And so far we've talked about the 3/4 principles of faith of the advisor. And then last week we talked in length about the pleasure and will. And we noted a new development that in pleasure, the self is not important, that something is my pleasure or not my pleasure is not important. But when it comes to will, I need to want to be the one who is the catalyst for the change. I need to want to be the one who will change this person's life. I can't just say, like we say in pleasure, somebody else can get the pleasure. Here it's, I need to do this. And the reason is because I I want to engage all my will. I want to make sure all my strength, all my energy is put into helping the person who's coming to me. So that I don't say, well, someone else will do it, someone else will finish the task, or so on. It has to be a full complete effort on my part to do that. And the only way to achieve that is by feeling that it is up to me. My will has to really be involved. It has to be to my name, as it were. So this is a great place from which to start what we're going to talk about today, which is the wisdom of the advisor. If will was, it is about me, so wisdom is always the nullification of the self, so it's not about me. It's not about me at all. Who is it about? Well, really, it's about what God is going to do here. I'm just a placeholder. I'm just a place where this is happening. I'm like a reference point. That is the essence of wisdom always, to not see myself as the agent, not see myself as having any room, not taking up any room. And this is a great task that a person has to do, and we've learned a lot about it over the years, but basically in the end, this is when you sit with yourself and you've just met someone new, you have to make room. You have to figure out, how do I move myself over to the side? How do I nullify myself from the picture here? How do I leave the room, as it were, and let it all be God? This is the opposite of will. Will is like yeshut, it's like being. But wisdom, this next stage, is non-being. The more space I make, wisdom is, when we talk about the 4 letters of God's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei. So one of the parallels that is described is that they are they correspond to the process of creation. And what's the first thing that has to happen in every process of creation? Is contraction, tzimtzum. The moving away of the presence of what there already is, that has to be.
Use the term purge.
To purge, right? That's also purge. Same idea. So in this case, the tzimtzum is the yud. And yud is also wisdom. So it's like, in order to create a process of healing here, something has to move away, something has to be contracted, something has to be subtracted. And the thing that's subtracted is me, the advisor. It's very interesting, because the whole problem is that when somebody comes to see a psychologist, a psychiatrist, any kind of advisor, they're coming to see them because apparently they have the solution. Right? That's how they feel. It's my duty to make sure that, even though they came to see me, that it's not me that they're seeing. They should be seeing God, not me. But if I'm all present here, if it's all about me, then there's no room for God to insert himself. There's something else has to come down and appear, and for that to happen, I have to move myself away. I have to nullify myself. So that's the wisdom. But the interesting thing here is that this is not just about me. Again, it's not about just me moving away. Why do we do that? So the Middle Rebbe explains in length, and one day we'll learn this old treatise. It's called Shar HaYichud. And it's a whole book that he wrote about the interaction between a teacher and a student. And that's the reason why in Hasidus it was common to say that if King Solomon would have known about how complex the relationship between a teacher and a student is, he wouldn't have written the Song of Songs about a man and a groom and a bride, a man and a woman. He wouldn't have written it about the relationship between a man and a woman. He would have written it about the relationship between a teacher and a student, because it's a much more complex relationship. And it's much easier to go into depth into it, because we've all had good teachers, put it that way. We all know what it's like to have a good teacher. So if we know what it's like, it's very easy to explain to us, well, this is the type of relationship between God and the Jewish people that we find replicated in the relationship between a man and a woman, and in the relationship between the teacher and the student. But the teacher and the student is much easier to talk about and is much more complex, actually. A few weeks ago, I didn't mention this, but I was reading a paper somebody wrote about the acceptance of Schelling. Maybe I did mention it, not sure. The acceptance of Schelling in the Jewish world in the 1800s. And Schelling was a very important philosopher who basically started the process of demythologizing the ancient world. And without him, there would be no Freud. And a lot of things that happened in the 19th century were dependent on the work that Schelling and Hegel did. But in my opinion, everything that has to do with the soul, with the psyche, depended a lot more on Schelling. But that's an aside. So he was accepted in certain ways in the Jewish world. There were different Jewish thinkers that talked about him. And one of the most interesting things that this paper brought out was the extent to which Schelling had studied Kabbalah, which I was not aware of. And unfortunately, the access to translated texts in the 1790s and 1800s and 1810s was very limited. There wasn't very much that had been translated into Latin or into German or into whatever. No, he wasn't Jewish. He was a German philosopher. But he got his hands on some things, and in my opinion, from what the sources that he brought that I wasn't aware of also, it seems to me that he must have had discussions with someone who was a Chabad Chassid, because some of the things that he mentions are just too strongly Chabad. They're not talked about in Kabbalah. And one of those things was the relationship between a teacher and a student. And what he mentioned was that when you think about the word Kabbalah, he says, is very insightful. He says, Kabbalah deems to mimic the transmission from God by not replacing it, but finding it in the relationship between the teacher and student. In other words, if you know how to listen to your teacher, then you receive godly revelation. Which is exactly what the Midler Rebbe's argument is. So I found it hard to believe that he hit upon this by himself and he didn't hear it somewhere. I mean, he says it in a very nice and beautiful language. It's a very deep thought that the more you can be batal, the more you can be open to hearing your teacher, the more you become open to hearing the infinite. It's like that this whole teacher-student relationship is meant to make us sensitive to hearing things from above. And that's why it's such a big deal. And by the way, that was definitely something in the Hasidic world. It wasn't so much the case. It was the case, but there wasn't very much talk about it, about how important it is for the students in there weren't exactly regular yeshivas yet at that time. So there were more like certain great people had some people around them that they listened to them all, that they were their students. But it wasn't a concept like that you would start at age 18 and you would come to someone and you would listen to him for 10, 20 years. It wasn't anything like that at that time. It was very rare if there was. It wasn't a regular type of yeshiva learning. And this was really happening mostly in the Hasidic world. Because it had become very important, this relationship of a Rebbe and a disciple, not just a teacher and a student. It's a much higher level of involvement, which you can see is a type of connection which is almost like a husband and a wife. Right? That the way that I treat the Rebbe in a certain sense is almost like he's my husband, almost like he's the one who's inseminating me in some way with his knowledge. But not just his knowledge in the sense of information, but in terms of you become him. And that idea is taken, of course, from the Torah, where it says that Moshe says to the Jewish people, until today, after 40 years that you've known me, you haven't had a knowing heart. And the concept of a knowing heart is something that they picked up on only after 40 years being with Moses and taking him in and hearing him for 40 years. Then they have become one with him in a certain sense. They've unified with him. They become Moses themselves. So that until now, he says, Ki ad hayom lo natan Hashem Elokechem lachem lev ladat. that until now, God has not given you a knowing heart. And this was in the 40th year, the 40th anniversary of their knowing Moses. And they had each become, by listening to him for 40 years, they become inseminated with Moses themselves. It was like they grew into becoming Moses. So that idea of the relationship between a Rebbe and a student, that's its source in the Torah, but it was strongly developed in the Hasidic world. And that's the Rebbe and the Chassid, who listens to him and actually becomes one like him. He tries to become him in a certain sense. And so Shelley picked up on this, and again, I think that he must have talked to someone in the Chabad world, or somewhere else in the Hasidic world, because he basically states the thesis of the Mittler Rebbe's Shara HaYichud. That's exactly what he says there, and he says that when you look at that process of becoming between a student and a teacher, you see the best example of what it means to become godly, of how we take in the infinite. So you mentioned the purging before, which is perfect here, because I'm making space not just for the sake of saying I'm not the one who's giving the advice. I'm making space so that the advice can come into me. Meaning that making space, that being willing to be in a state of emptiness, that it's not me, is not just a goal, it's an instrument. It has utility. And the utility that it has is that allows God to work through me, so that the advice also comes through. Not just that right, just to say, right, we explained this many times when we talked about dealing with the ego, but the whole concept of self-nullification is not for the purpose of just saying, I'm no one. That anyone can say. You are really nullified when you do great things. Right? When because of that nullification you become a vessel for doing great things, like Moses. That he is the most null person who's ever walked the face of the earth. And because of that, he can do these great monumental achievements that he had during his life, and he says they're all God, they're not me. Right? That's the essence of self-nullification. So there's two sides to this always. And this is a very important point, that wisdom on the one hand is the nullification of the self. It's becoming into a state of not attributing anything to myself. But the flip side of that, and how do you know that the attribution is really working, that you've stopped attributing everything to yourself? How do you know that that's really functioning properly? By seeing that great things are coming through. That there is knowledge that I could not have come up with by myself, and you're doing great things, and you're dedicating your time really to do these important tasks. That's the sign that it's working. So in that sense, the nullification of the advisor is also the key to unlocking how to start the process of healing. The more nullified I am, the more that initial grain of insight from above will have room to take hold in my mind and to inform me about what direction I should go in with this particular person. But we've also, in passing, we've said something very important that we might have missed. And that is that every therapeutic process is a teaching process. People don't like to hear that. They like to think that I'm neutral. I'm not sharing my beliefs. I'm not sharing my thoughts. But that can be good for support. And when you support someone, you have to give them a lot of room, and you have to listen to them, and so on. And that's also an essential part of any therapeutic process. But the overall description of a therapeutic process in the end is that I'm teaching. I have to become a Rebbe. If I can't become a Rebbe, and again, a Rebbe is someone who is not here, who makes room for Hashem to be here, for God to be here.
you mean that there's a whole shita in therapy that the advisor is just helping the person get in touch with their own inner wisdom?
Right.
And you're saying it's more than that.
That's an element. It's an important element that the person should be in touch with themselves and uncover and be comfortable with themselves. But that's like the support that I can offer.
Okay.
The support anyone can give. It's not. I mean, a good friend that listens to you. That's why most of the time it's enough. Most of the time you don't need something as far-reaching as therapy. What you need is a support network. And that's why there's a big shift now in the whole psychological world, especially the psychiatric world, to create circles of support around people who show initial symptoms of psychosis or of neurosis and so on. To try to involve as many people around them that can offer the support, because usually that'll do the trick. And it won't let the situation deteriorate further.
That's why the 12-step programs and all those kinds of things.
They offer that, right. They offer some of that, right. But unfortunately, they also try to teach. Indoctrinate.
It's like Talbia was
right.
mental health, because people were getting stuck there, so it's better to bring them out into the real world.
Right, so right, and you did Nefesh doing that. And this all started in London, to the best of my knowledge, and I had a chance to meet Professor Lowenthal, not Tali, not the male side of that partnership, but the female side. She's a professor of psychology at the London School of Economics, if I'm not mistaken, or the London, whatever they call it there. I don't know what it's called. And so she was in Israel 2.5 months ago or 3 months ago, and I met them over Shabbos, and it was a very, very interesting discussion. And so we talked about that development. There was a whole program. Joe Burke, who was who passed away 2 years ago during Corona, so he was also instrumental in setting that up. And this was all started by someone who I don't remember his name, in the 50s in London, and it's made more and more headway now, and people are beginning to understand, because really, if you get the person at the end of the process, it's very hard to turn the dial back. But if you're able to set up these support circles around them while they're going through the difficulties, it's a lot easier, and a lot of times they won't even get to the harsh diagnosis.
Can I just ask you to answer a Nefesh question in this where we're holding, in the context of Hashanah, Havdalah, and Hamtakah, where does this Chokhmah fit in? Is this the process of within Havdalah when we do the separation, or is it as the therapist, or is it the Hashanah of the therapist? Because we're doing this process.
So we're doing a whole partzuf here of the Sfirot. To divide them into Achna, Havdalah, Hamtakah, really what I would do, and the Rav didn't do this, but you sort of set the direction, is that each one of these has to be divided itself into Achna, Havdalah, Hamtakah. Meaning each one of these in and of themselves has a 3-part process that the therapist has to go through. And we've talked many times about what it means to go through Achna, about my ego, about my sense of self, my Achna, then my Havdalah, identifying with something higher, and then finally sweetening. The sweetening here would be that, let's just say it if we're already saying it, so the Achna would be the moving myself aside. The Havdalah would be to identify with the wisdom that's coming from above, with the super consciousness that's coming down. And the Hamtakah would be to actually figure out what exactly does this mean in terms of this particular person that I'm with now, this particular client, and why am I the person who is administering this? So it would be like that. This whole thing is fixing, is a rectification for the will that we talked about before. That it can only be me in a certain sense. I have to put all of myself into this. I have to invest my whole being into this. So why is it me? Because in a certain sense, I'm the only one who can administer this advice. It is particular to me. Right? We're not saying that anybody, this is the answer, this is the direction of therapy that would have come to anyone. It's different for each therapist. So when I do the self-nullification here and allow divine wisdom to come in, and to show me a direction and a path, it will be particular to me. Because it is a contraction, not just a contraction in the sense of that I'm moving aside, but it's a contraction after will, so there's something particular to what's going to come down that's going to be a very focused and a very it's not focused, the word I'm looking at, very high density, like principle that is only true for me. I'm the only one who could have seen this principle. Someone else would not have received it. So it's not like you can go to anyone and you get the same answer. Because that's how we see it as in Torah, that every person that takes on treating a certain sugya, a certain issue in the Torah, he comes up with a particular point of view, which we say in the end is what God says. How could that be? Because there are many, many facets. And depending on the chacham, depending on the sage, you'll see a different facet, a different answer to that issue, a different approach to that issue. But they're all divrei Elokim Chaim. They're all the words of Hashem. But each person receives something else. So that would be the hamtakah, that would be the sweetening. Okay. Actually, we've been at it for a while, so I wanted to do the next three, which are a group together, but we're almost, we're more than halfway through it, I believe. So I want to switch to talk a little bit more about Yotet Kislev, and hopefully this will also connect for us very strongly into everything we've been doing. So I mentioned in the beginning that I would compare Yotet Kislev today to, I hope there was some kind of yontiv, some kind of special day that they had upon the writing of the Mishnah, when they finished writing the Mishnah, because writing the Mishnah ushered in a new phase in Judaism. It's hard for us to understand this because we're always so asynchronous. We don't live, it's hard for us to imagine what would it have been like to live through that transition. Because for us, the Judaism means Mishnah, Talmud, Shulchan Aruch, Rashi. It's already part of who we are. It's in our genetic, in our spiritual genetics. Like we can't imagine ourselves without this. But they didn't have it before Rebbe wrote the Mishnah, or compiled it, or brought it together, or did the work that was needed to create this book. And just the fact that it was written down, Rebbe. No, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. We're talking about the year 180, 190 CE, right? So we're talking about 1800, 1900 years ago. So we can't imagine what it was like, but it was a really landmark moment. And so I don't remember that it's mentioned in Megillat Ta'anit. There's a short tractate that has all the Yamim Tovim that they had in the past. I don't remember that it says there that there was a day. I may be wrong, maybe there was a day, but I'm saying Yotet Kislev is the same thing. Why? So to understand fully the impact or the program behind Hasidus, I want to read you something short from a Sikha that is in Likutei Sichos Volume 1. And actually, if you follow the morning classes, I spoke about it today, but much briefer, it's only a few minutes. The Rebbe told the following story, that when the Alterabi was in the prison, and remember that he was with a death sentence over his head, meaning he was being charged with treason, that he was passing money to the Turkish government, and he was trying to instigate a rebellion against the Russians, and all kinds of things. So those things are easily punishable by death. And in a certain sense, when he went into this whole ordeal, he had accepted the sentence already. He had accepted that this might be it. And many Jews, many great people have met their demise this way. That they were captured over the Torah that they taught, and because of that it led them to trouble with the authorities, and they saw it as something rebellious and so on. They don't understand at all what Torah is. They have no clue. And they accepted their fate, like Rabbi Akiva accepted his fate, and many were like that. In a certain sense, he was already outside his body. he was already, he had already accepted this fate. But he didn't accept it like a person going to his demise with tremendous agony and with frustration, and more importantly, a sense of, I made a mistake. There's no regrets in it. It's a feeling that this is the culmination of my life's work. And then, says the Rebbe, he had a strange conversation. That one of the people that came to investigate him, to ask him questions, was very knowledgeable in Yiddishkeit and very knowledgeable in Torah. A goy, a non-Jew. He was an aide to the minister who had signed the warrant to arrest him, and he knew Bible, and he knew more than just Bible, as we'll see. And he asked him a very interesting question. He asked him, it says that after they ate from the tree of knowledge and they were hiding, God called Adam, he called out to Adam and said, "Where are you?" Ayeka. Right. And so he says to the Alterabi, what does this mean? God doesn't know where he is. What is this? And so the Alterabi started saying the Rashi on it. And this aide to the minister smiled. He was a very smart man. And he said, the Rashi I know already. I want to hear your answer.
Wow.
He didn't tell him it was Rashi. He just started saying the Rashi on it. He says, the Rashi I've heard. I want to hear what you have to say about it. And this is an incredible moment. You'll see in a moment, there's stuff going on in this moment that is life transforming. So the Alterabi answers, from where I don't know. He says to him, when a person reaches such and such an age, and he said an age, 51, 52, 53, whatever it was, that was the exact age of this investigator. So when he reaches this age, God calls out to him and asks him, where are you? And the meaning of that call is, do you know what the purpose of your creation is? Do you know what you have been entrusted with to perform in your life? And how far along are you in achieving that? That's what he says to him. And it says that, well, it doesn't just say, the Friediger Rebbe said, the previous Rebbe said, that when he answered this answer, the Alterabi changed, his whole demeanor shifted. This answer moved him out of the state that he was in before and brought him into something new. I said before, the Alterabi himself. By giving this answer, he himself was transformed. He was moved. And there's an amazing thing that the Friediger Rebbe is saying. First of all, how does he know? So he probably heard about it. But even to say something like that, like you're saying that the Alterabi didn't know everything, he knew. And when he was asked this question and he had to give this answer, it changed him. He took it as a sign that this answer was almost like a prophecy. First of all, there was this interesting fact that he gave out a number, and he didn't know what the age was, but the number turned out to be exact. People who are cynical would say they were the same age. He was talking about himself. It could be. It could be that it worked out. But even that's a fact that says something very interesting. So, I believe it was 58 at the time, maybe 57. So he said this number, and it was the right number, but the more important thing was that the question already awakened in him that if he is asking me about where are you, somebody told him to ask that. That came from above. That's a question that came from above. Now, this is almost, if you want, this is an example of what it means to be an advisor. It's almost like the investigator is like the client who's coming to the advisor, and the advisor sees that the questions that he's asking him, they're awakening not just the answer, but the question already is awakening in me a certain direction. So the Frierdiker Rebbe says it caused the Alterabi to feel that he was being asked from above, where are you? And the question of where are you is saying to him, what is your life's mission? How are you aware of it? And how far along are you in fulfilling it? Now you have to understand, this is revolutionary. Why is it so revolutionary? Because in the year 1797, 98, 99, you couldn't say that yet. That was a new concept. That's already in America they were just figuring out that every person has a soul, and that was the basis of democracy, that every person should get a vote, that they were equal in a certain sense. So we're talking about, 1798 was when 89 was when the Constitution was written.
Also, also a revolution, because it's like by writing down something so deep, he's saying every person
has a mission,
has access to this.
Right? We all have a mission. Individually, there is personhood. Meaning, God is not looking. Before that, what would have been the answer? Before he said this statement, the answer was simple. It says in the Shulchan Aruch what I need to do. That's my mission. That's what I'm supposed to do. He's coming and saying, your mission is not written in any book. It's not written down. It's Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's an oral tradition that has yet to be written. And who writes it? You write it. This is a book that you're writing as you live. Again, this is like writing down, committing to writing in a certain sense, the oral history of a human, of a single human. This is a tremendous revolution in thought. But this is where the whole Hasidic movement is pushing. That's where it's going to. That every human being has a separate mission. We're not all copies of the same organism that just needs to follow what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. What it says in the Shulchan Aruch, that is minimal. That's the basis. That's just how you brush your teeth. It's not beyond that yet. But the real questions that you face are the questions of the individual. So he says, Ayeka, he wasn't talking to Adam, he was talking to each one of us. And so when he realized that, says the Frierdiker Rebbe, it shocked him. And he said, no, I wasn't sent here to culminate my life in this grand ascent to heaven. I'm not finished at all. If God is now saying this to me, he just asked me, where are you? And my answer is, well, I have a mission, and where am I in fulfilling it? That's the question I'm being asked. What's my answer? So he says, I can't give up now. It's not giving up. He wasn't giving up. He just thought, okay, this is the end. This is how it ends. It's okay. I did what I did. I fulfilled what I needed to fulfill. Now he's understanding. I don't need to fulfill what it says in a certain book. I need to fulfill my life. My life's mission, which is something very personal, and it's not written in any book. It's oral tradition. It's written as I live. So why is this? So this in and of itself is a tremendous point that the Rebbe makes. That from here he is now talking about what we call personhood. We've talked about this in the sense of self-nullification many times. That there are 4 levels of self-nullification, and the highest level is when you see yourself through the king's eyes. You see yourself as a servant through the king's eyes. You see yourself through God's eyes. where you are not just an extension even of his will, but rather you're a separate will that he created. You have personhood, and he's expecting you to do something with that will that he gave you. The willpower, the free will that he gave you. It's not just an extension. There is a contraction in the middle. There is a gap. And there's the question of what will you do with the free will that you've been given. And that becomes the question of what life is about. So that's something that's very, very deep in Chabad. It's a foundation of thought that I have to get to the level of self-nullification where I'm null before the king, but I see that the king, when he looks at me, he expects me to go and do something with this gift I've been given, which is called free will. So he assumes I'm his servant. He assumes that I will do what he wants, but he's not assuming that I'm just an extension, that I have no say of my own. On the contrary, he's waiting to see that I take this gift of free will and that I use it to fulfill his will, that I come to know what God wants from me, what the world wants from me. What is my life about? So that in and of itself is a great point. And he says that from that moment on, the Alterabi was in a different state. From that moment on, he wasn't he knew this was not going to end with his demise, and he realized that he would be sent out. And that now he had to really start his mission. Now he really had to develop this a lot more than he had even before. And that's where he got his energy when he came out to spend the next 12 years really pushing very hard to develop this thing called the Torah of Chabad and to continue elaborating on what he had written down already in the Tanya. So that's the first point that the Rebbe makes. The second point is much deeper. The second point is not from the Friediger Rebbe. Right? This is already the Rebbe himself adds, and he says, "What exactly is going on here? What do you mean? Why couldn't the Alter Rebbe have known this by himself? Why did he need to be asked this question from above?" So he starts by this. What is the difference between Kabbalah and Hasidus? The big difference is as follows. Kabbalah is the secrets of the Torah. It's the hidden dimension of the Torah. Can it be understood by the regular human mind? No. It's something that's what most people understood it. Kabbalah, it's something that's received from above. It's a revelation from above. That's how people understood it. As such, it speaks only to the divine mind. It only speaks to our divine soul. It can't speak to our animal soul, because the animal soul doesn't understand anything about the divine. It can't even speak to our intellectual soul, because it's not couched in rational terms. It's a take it or leave it type of proposition. You either accept it or you don't accept it. That's how Kabbalah is. So you sit learning Kabbalah, and many people spend many, many years, and it's a memory game in a certain sense. Why is it a memory game? Because there's very little chance that you could extrapolate from one point to the other. Rather, you just have to accept that it's this and this and this and this and this, and you have to remember many, many, many facts and relationships and gematriot, and it's just a wealth of information that you have to hold in your mind. And you are warned time and again, do not extrapolate. Do not infer. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't make any conclusions, in fact. Don't try to reverse engineer. This is given. It is how it is. Okay, so there's people who very much enjoy this. By the way, this is very different than the revealed dimension of Torah, because the revealed dimension of Torah, in the Mishnah perhaps, there's a state of I have to accept it the way it is, but the moment the Talmud hits, everything is up for debate. And everything is questioned. And everything has to follow a logical inference. And everything has to make sense. But in the hidden dimension in Kabbalah, there was no such thing. Either take it or leave it. There's no two options. You can't discuss it. You can't argue against it. You can't argue for it. Nothing. Hasidus is not like that at all. What does Hasidus do? It takes those, call them premises, these axioms of Kabbalah, and it then translates it into intellectual language, into the language of the mind, into the language of rational thought. As such, what is it doing? It's bridging the gap between the divine soul and the animal soul. It's allowing me to create a language, an intellectual, rational language that can bridge that gap. Before he was put into custody, before his arrest, the Alterabi was teaching Hasidus, but more closer to Kabbalah, more like just accept it, that this is the way it is. It was very short. He said short things that, for a lot of people, they made a big impact on them. But it's an impact. It's not because they understood it. It's because, wow, if this is true, this is very impactful. But how do you know that this is... And some people, and most people couldn't even understand what impact it was having. It was too high for them. When he came out of the arrest, he dedicated himself to explaining it fully in language that every person could understand. And what's the main language that he uses? The language of the psyche, the language of psychology. That's the main intellectual form of Kabbalah that Hasidus translates it into. So it'll take the Kabbalistic principles, like we just talked about wisdom. Wisdom is Chokhmah, it's a sphera. We're not talking about Chokhmah, no one even knows what Chokhmah is. We begin to talk about something that we all understand. What does it mean for me to remove myself and to allow something else to come in, to become aware of higher knowledge than the knowledge that I have? And it's not just in any place. It's become part of a process between an advisor and someone who comes to get advice from them. It's become something very real in the regular, normal world that every person can study, every person can learn this. Obviously, there's always levels of what people understand, but this is something that you can write a book about, and you can write it in plain English. You don't have to use the word, you can use the word wisdom, you could use the word chokhmah, and then nobody understands, but it's okay if you then translate and say, this is what wisdom means. We don't say wisdom like it's some kind of, holy word, and nobody knows what it means, you just have to accept it. You explain, this is what I mean, to the point where every person can connect to it, can understand it, can experience it, feel it, know what you're talking about. So one of the, if not the major translations that the Alterabi did was to translate the language of Kabbalah, the language of the Torah's hidden dimension, into the language of Torah psychology. This translation, which now straddles two opposites, the divine and the mundane, the divine and the animal, within me, means that I'm holding somehow a paradox inside me. Why is this a paradox? Because the divine speaks one language, and the mundane and the animal soul speak a completely different language. And the ability to translate from one into the other is like an act of, it's like wizardry. How can you they're not just talking two different languages, one's talking Spanish, one's talking English. That I know how to translate. Their whole conceptual scheme of reality is different. It's like explaining the world of the human to a donkey, right? Because that's what the animal soul is like. That's what it functions like. Well, it's a little bit more complex. It knows how to eat more than just straw and hay, right? But in the end, that's its world. Those are its images. That's how it's living. You need to eat. You need to drink. You need to procreate. You need to sleep, and you need to go to the bathroom. That's what it knows. You should digest your food in the middle, right? So you're not going on empty. That's the world of the animal soul. It's like now you're going to explain to me the highest ideas that come from the divine into the language of the donkey. How are you going to do that? They're completely different. If you can do that, you've created a paradoxical state in the middle. You've created what we call a wormhole today. It's a wormhole. It's like you've taken space and you've folded it somehow, making it possible to move from here to there, where there was an infinite gap in between. So you somehow created a paradox in the middle and allowed there to be communication between the two sides. For that, he needed to hear this from God. The Alterabi knew. The Rebbe says Alterabi knew all this, but he had not yet heard it from God. How did he suddenly hear it from God? He says this non-Jew comes in, and he's coming to investigate him, and he asks him this question. And so he sees, if this non-Jew is now a conduit, he's expressing God's will to me. He says to me, the Rashi I know. What? Where did that come from? How learned is this guy? Or is this coming from above? And it's saying to me, where are you? He's saying to me, you have to find the translation. You're the one who has to make this transition from a Judaism that is governed only by the Shulchan Aruch to a Judaism that sees the person and says the Shulchan Aruch is not enough. There has to be a personal mission in life. There has to be the personal Shulchan Aruch. The personal question of where are you going, what are you achieving, how much have you achieved already. That has to come into. That is Yutet Kislev. The day that he was allowed to start this program. In that sense, it's like the Mishnah. It's like taking Torah and now expanding it into the realm of the person. Expanding it into the realm, not of the individual as someone who just follows the rules, but the individual who is painting a picture of godliness in the world. And every individual is doing that. Every person has that potential.
You say that this non-Jew was like the mouthpiece for Hashem to transmit this message to God.
That's what I'm saying. That's what the Rebbe is saying.
And as a therapist, in a way, that's what we're striving. One is striving.
Exactly. To be that mouthpiece. I think that the world doesn't yet understand how revolutionary this is, because as you're going through it, it seems to you, well, if you follow halachic responsa over the last 40, 50, 60 years, actually not enough, you have to go back to 150 years actually, and you start seeing the state of the individual, the person, infiltrating halachic considerations, you begin to see that something's changing. That poskim are no longer talking about what the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch says. They're talking about the state of the individual has to perform it. And as usual, where does this always start from? From women. Those are always the first to create that revolution. No, the women with their issues, raising their issues, and the way to explain it is that poskim they're more harsh towards men and they're softer towards women, so they're more accommodating. And so you begin to see this shift of talking about the person. So what is her condition? Where is she? To the point where the Munkacher Rebbe, who was most famous for it, who passed away, I think, in the 80s. So it's about 35, 40 years ago. His responsa are filled with this. It becomes a very important consideration for him in every psak that he gives. Like, how will this affect the individual supposed to perform this psak? That becomes a consideration for the psak itself. It was always somewhere, but not the way it's discussed now when he says, what is her psychological state? What will this lead to? How will it affect the future? Those weren't questions that were asked, definitely not in this way. Not seeing the person as a person, but rather seeing them as a generic individual. So when we're living through the process, I would do a very easy comparison. In Hebrew, how many books on Torah have come out in the last year that are, call it, traditional books? And how many books are with the individualistic psychological bent. I think you'll find that it's probably about equal. Certainly the ones that are selling are not the traditional ones. The ones that are really selling, the people who are interested in, the people that are talking and being listened to, the influencers, they're all talking about the personhood. And that is what the Alterabi started. I mean, that's what the Baal Shem Tov saw, the importance of the individual, and tried to show that Torah has something to say about this. He's extending the scope of Torah to not just be about the community, not just be about halacha, but now to govern the personhood of the person, the life story, the mission, all that. And that becomes, that's the way that we teach Hasidus. We don't teach Hasidus as just, you could learn Hasidus as just another area of Torah. But we always learn it as this is an area of Torah that is always focused on the individual. It can be focused on more, but first of all, it's focused on the individual. But the more general statement is that Hasidus is finding an intellectual language that can translate between the divine and the mundane. And so, it's true that psychology is very important, but there's another area that's just as important. Because another area of the mundane is all of what we call the exact sciences. And for that, you have to find a language that translates between Torah and the exact sciences. What's that language? So that language is definitely mathematics, but it can't be mathematics the way that we know them as numbers just being generic and having no meaning. It has to be what we call gematria. And the way that Rav Ginsburg has expanded over the years and made it infiltrate all the areas of modern math. When we talk about psychology, couching Hasidus, or the intellect of Hasidus in psychological language, we're giving a language that can be used for all the humanities. It's not just for, it's also a language for medicine even. Because even medicine, in the end, is psychology. It's true that we can manipulate a lot of physical things, but the reason sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, as we've seen many times from Reb Nachman, is because it depends, again, on the personhood. It depends on how the person is taking it. So if the person has a lot of faith that this will work, even something that works poorly might help. And if the person doesn't have any faith and doesn't want to live or doesn't want to get well, doesn't believe in themselves, so even something that is surefire may not work or won't work as well or may cause tremendous side effects. Because in the end, this is the language that defines all of the person. So we have the natural world on the outside and the human world on the inside. And the two languages of the intellect are mathematics and psychology. And these are languages into which Hasidus translates, or creates even. Okay.
And it's a model that can also, here we're talking in a talking therapeutic context, but it's definitely a model that can be applied to many other therapeutic modalities, if it's not through massage or dance
or art.
This is the backdrop from what I work from. Mm-hmm. I have to have this. If I don't, I'm finished. It's all ego. Right. But
you translate it further. You take it into every area that you go, but you have to have this intellectual language that forms the basis of what else you're going to do with this.
Right, totally.
So the source here is that the Alterabi began to translate from the divine into the mundane. The chosen language in most cases is the psychological language, it's the language of the nefesh, and it can be expanded into any area of the humanities, social sciences, political science, whatever it is. It governs all of them. And in that sense, it's an expansion of the Torah into the realm that it was never in. I can't say that the Torah was not in the realm of natural sciences. It was to a certain extent, but here, when we're talking about into the personhood, this is new because there wasn't such a concept really before. This concept of a person and individual freedom and individual character and everything that we roll into psychology today, this all is related to the shift we've talked about so many times about the rise of the individual from the 19th century and on. So that's what this day is about. It's that Torah has, in a sense, ushered itself into a whole new world, which was even not that well known at the time, and it now covers that also. Okay.
Wow, beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Wow,
Wow.
you're doing such a
Recording stopped.
Yeah.